talking about the dystopian genre this month, and one thing that I wanted to talk about is classic dystopian novels versus modern day, particularly young adult dystopian novels, because there are some differences. Obviously, the excessive number of love triangles being one of the differences, and the age of the protagonist being another. But one difference that's a little bit less superficial that I wanted to talk about is the endings, and what the endings say about what the book is really about. You see, classic dystopian novels typically end tragically, or at least on a very bittersweet note. 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451 all have either very tragic endings or bittersweet endings. They don't end happily ever after. The characters don't overthrow the corrupt system. They don't bring about, change that will impact the entire world. They don't achieve anything for themselves necessarily. Even if there is a little spark of hope, like at the end of Fahrenheit 451, they're very bleak kind of scenarios. On the other hand, young adult dystopian novels from the early 2000s through the present tend to be a lot more optimistic. Even the ones where the settings have very dark implications, like The Hunger Games, for instance. On some level, I feel like The Hunger Games is even a more dystopian society than some of the classic ones, because while everything is very oppressive and you have no privacy and no freedom in, say, 1984, they don't make kids fight to the death on live TV. That's just a whole other level of excessive cruelty in the world of The Hunger Games. But at the same time, the ending to the series is very optimistic. It's almost kind of similar to the Harry Potter epilogue. You have the characters, however many years later, married with kids, living in a better world that they fought to bring about. And a lot of other novels or series from the same time period are very similar. For instance, one trilogy that I read when I was in high school was titled Delirium, and it was a dystopia in which people are not allowed to experience love. Love is considered a disease, and there is a cure for it, and it will take away not only your ability to love romantically, but your ability to feel strong friendship or love for your family members as well. And that trilogy also, it had a happy ending. I mean, it didn't entirely have a happy ending for every single character. There were likable characters that didn't make it to the end or didn't get a happy ending, but for the main character and for society as a whole, the ending was positive. Another book series that I enjoyed around the same time period was titled Across the Universe by Beth Revis, which is not entirely a dystopian story. It's kind of a sci-fi story with some dystopian elements. It takes place on a spaceship, so it's not really a future society similar to ours on, planet Earth. But it does have a lot of dystopian elements to it. Particularly the first one is very dystopian, and it ends on a very positive note. And then I can't talk about this without talking about the book series that got me hooked on dystopian stories in the first place, which was Shadow Children by Margaret Peterson Haddix. Shadow Children is a middle grade dystopian series written for older elementary school kids, and it's actually 7 books, so not a standalone or a trilogy. The last book kind of explores the idea that, taking down the corrupt leader of a bad system doesn't necessarily mean that the system is fixed, and it may be that just another bad leader fills the power vacuum and you still have all the same problems. You have people who've been brainwashed, who have all of these wrong ideas, and you still don't have, freedom of speech or anything. And so what the main characters think at the beginning is going to be just, happily ever after. It turns out they're not quite done, but by the end it gets to a point where it really looks like things are looking up going forward, and we're going to be able to move on from all of the bad stuff that's happened in books 1 through 6. Even Divergent, which is kind of infamous for having a tragic ending, it's not tragic in the way that classic dystopian endings are. Even though, spoiler alert, the main character doesn't survive, still society is improved because of what she and her friends did, which is more than you can say for example, the world of 1984. It's not improved at all by what Winston and Julia do. This fits really closely with another observation of mine, which is that newer dystopian novels, young adult dystopian novels in particular, tend to have almost kind of a chosen one type hero, very similarly to a lot of young adult and middle grade fantasy novels. Katniss from The Hunger Games is probably the best example of this because she's kind of set up to be that chosen one hero who's the figurehead for a rebellion. And that's not entirely her doing. That's a lot of people putting a lot of pieces in place to put her there to take advantage of the kind of movement that she has inadvertently started. But there tends to be kind of a widespread thing of, this 16-year-old girl is the only one who can take down the corrupt government of the dystopian society. And that's very different from how things were in the older dystopian work. In 1984, for instance, Winston and Julia are not, some kind of chosen one rebel leaders. They're barely aware of anything that might be going on as far as resistance against the party. They're easily manipulated by people that are not trustworthy. They mostly just want to be together. And ultimately they fail. And the main character of Fahrenheit 451, yeah, he tries to prevent books from being burned, but he's ultimately not successful. The only thing that he manages to do is to memorize part of a book and to keep it preserved in that way. Those characters are not chosen one heroes. They're, in the beginning, part of the society that's being criticized and relatively high up in it and doing things that feed right into how people are being oppressed and controlled. And then by the end, even though they've learned to think for themselves and to kind of push back against all of that, they still ultimately are pretty insignificant. They're not Katniss Everdeen. The older dystopian classics tend to be cautionary tales about a world that's gone so wrong that there is no hope of fixing it, or if there is, it's a very faint glimmer of hope beneath a lot of unpleasantness. Modern young adult dystopian books tend to be more stories of hope and inspiration and saying that you can fight back against a corrupt system and you can change a world that's gone wrong. It's not that they don't portray worlds that are just as harsh and unpleasant as the ones in older dystopian works, but they don't go so far as to say that because things have gone that direction that you can't go back or that you can't go in a better direction in the future.